Good evening, my grandchildren. Grandpa loves you. I think I skipped chapters 17 and 18, so I'm going to read them for you and try and get them up so you can read them first. If you remember in chapter 16, they had made a crate for Wilbur, and they were headed off to the fair. And so 17 and 18 is about getting to the fair. Chapter 17 is titled Uncle. When they pulled into the fairgrounds, they could hear the music and see the Ferris wheel turning in the sky, and they could smell the dust of the racetrack where the sprinkling cart had moistened it, and they could smell the hamburgers frying and see the balloons aloft, and they could hear the sheep blatting in their pens. An enormous voice over a loudspeaker said, "Attention, attention, please. Will the owner of the Pontiac car license number H2430 please move your car away from the fireworks shed?" "Can I have some money?" asked Fern. "Can I have some money too?" asked Avery. "I'm going to win a doll by spinning a wheel, and it will stop on just the right number," said Fern. "I'm going to steer a jet plane and make it bump into another plane," said Avery. "Can I have a balloon?" asked Fern. Can I? Can I have a frozen custard and a cheeseburger and a raspberry soda pop?" asked Avery. "You children be quiet until we get the pig unloaded," said Mrs. Arabelle. "Let's let the children go off by themselves," suggested Mr. Arabelle. "The fair only comes once a year." And the fair, Mr. Arabelle gave Fern 2 quarters and 2 dimes, and he gave Avery 5 dimes and 4 nickels. "Now run along," he said. "And remember, the money has to last all day. Don't spend it all in just a few minutes. Be back here at the truck by noontime so we can all have our lunch together. Don't eat a lot of stuff that's going to make you sick to your stomachs. And if you go on one of those swings," said Mrs. Arabelle, "you hang on tight. You hang on very tight." "And don't get lost," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "And don't get dirty. And don't get overheated," said their mother. "Watch out for pickpockets," cautioned their father. "And don't cross the racetrack when the horses are coming," cried Mr. Zuckerman. The children grabbed each other hand in hand, and they headed off for the direction of the merry-go-round. They were going towards the wonderful music and the wonderful adventure and the wonderful excitement and the wonderful midway where there would be no parents to guard them and guide them, and they could be happy and free and do as they pleased. And Mrs. Arabelle stood quietly and watched them go. She sighed. She blew her nose. "Do you really think it'll be all right?" she asked. "Well, they've got to grow up sometimes," said Mr. Arabelle, "and a fair is a good place to start, giving them some room, I guess." Here they go off to the Ferris wheel and the midway. While Wilbur was being unloaded and taken out of his crate and into his new pen, crowds gathered around and they began to read the sign, "Zuckerman's Famous Pig." Wilbur stared back and tried to look extra good. He was pleased with his new home. The pen was grassy and it shaded from the sun by a shed roof. Charlotte was watching her chance and scrambled out of the crate and climbed up onto a post on the underside of the roof. Nobody even noticed her. Templeton, not wishing to come out in broad daylight, stayed quietly under the straw at the bottom of the crate. Mr. Zuckerman poured some skim milk into Wilbur's trough and pitched clean straw into his pen, and then he and Mrs. Zuckerman and the Arabelles walked away toward the cattle barn to look at the purebred cows and to see the sights. Mr. Zuckerman particularly wanted to look at the tractors. Mrs. Zuckerman wanted to see the deep freeze, and Louvie went off by himself, hoping to meet some friends and have a little bit of fun on the midway. As soon as the people were gone, Charlotte spoke to Wilbur. "It's a good thing you can't see what I see," she said. "What do you see?" asked Wilbur. "Well, there's a pig right next door. And he is enormous. I'm afraid he is much, much bigger than you are." "Well, maybe he's older than I am. Maybe he's had more time to grow," suggested Wilbur. Tears began to come to his eyes. "I'll drop down and have a look," said Charlotte. Then she crawled along the beam until she was directly over the pen next door, and she let herself down on a drag line until she hung right in the air just in front of the big pig's snout. "May I ask your name?" she said politely. The pig stared at her. "No name," he said in a big, hearty voice. "I just call me Uncle." "Very well, Uncle," replied Charlotte. "What is the date of your birth? Are you a spring pig?" "Sure, I'm a spring pig," said the uncle. "What did you think I was, a spring chicken?" "Ho, ho, ho, ho." "That's a good one. Right, sister?" "Mildly funny," said Charlotte. "I've heard funnier ones, though. Glad to have met you, and now I must be going." And she ascended slowly and returned to Wilbur's pen. "He claims he's a spring pig," reported Charlotte. "Perhaps he is. The one thing is certain. He has a most unattractive personality. He is too familiar, too nosy, and he cracks wise jokes. Also, he's not anywhere near as clean as you are, nor as pleasant. I took quite a dislike to him in our brief interview. He's going to be a hard pig to beat, though. On account of his size and his weight, he is a champion pig. But with me helping you, we can win." "When are you going to spend a web, Charlotte?" asked Wilbur. "Well, this afternoon, late, if I'm not too tired," said Charlotte. The least thing seems to tire me these things, and I don't seem to have the energy that I once had. My age, I guess." Wilbur looked at his friend. She looked rather well swollen, and she seemed listless. "I'm awfully sorry to hear that you're not feeling well, Charlotte," he said. "Perhaps, if you spin a web and catch a couple of flies and eat them, you'll feel better." "Perhaps," she said wearily, "but I feel like the end of a long day." Clinging upside down to the ceiling, she settled down for a nap, leaving Wilbur very much worried. All morning people wandered in and looked at Wilbur's pen. Dozens and dozens of strangers stopped to stare at him and to admire his silky white coat, his curly tail, his kind and radiant expression, and they would move on to the next pen where the bigger pig lay. Wilbur heard several people make favorable remarks about Uncle's great size, and he couldn't help overhearing these remarks, and he couldn't help but to worry. And now, with Charlotte not feeling well, he thought, "Oh dear, what's going to be?" All morning Templeton slept quietly under the straw, and the day grew fiercely hot, and at noon the Zuckermans and the Arabels returned to the pig pen, and then a few minutes later Fern and Avery showed up, and Fern had a monkey doll in her arms and was eating Cracker Jacks. Avery had a balloon tied to his ear and a chewable candied apple. The children were hot, they were dirty. Mrs. Zuckerman was fanning herself. "Isn't it terribly hot?" she said. "Terribly hot," said Mrs. Arabel, fanning herself with an advertisement for a deep freeze. One by one they climbed into the truck and opened their lunch boxes. The sun beat down on everything. Nobody seemed to be that hungry. When are the judges going to decide about Wilbur?" asked Mrs. Zuckerman. "Well, not until tomorrow," said Mr. Zuckerman. Louvie appeared, carrying an Indian blanket that he had won. "That's just what we need," said Avery, "a blanket." "Of course it is," replied Louvie, and he spread the blanket across the sideboards of the truck so that it was like a little tent. The children sat in the shade under the blanket, and they felt better, and after lunch they stretched out and fell asleep. Chapter 18. The Cool of the Evening. In the cool of the evening, when the shadows darkened on the fairgrounds, Templeton crept out from the crate and looked around. Wilbur lay asleep in the straw. Charlotte was building a web. Templeton's keen nose detected many fine smells in the air. The rat was hungry and thirsty, and he decided to go exploring. Without saying a word to anybody, he just went off. "Bring me back a word," Charlotte called after him. "I shall be writing tonight for the last time." The rat mumbled something to himself, disappeared into the shadows. He didn't really like being treated like a messenger boy, and after the heat of the day, the evening came as a welcome relief to all. The Ferris wheel was lighted now, and it went around and around in the sky and seemed twice as high and twice as big as it was by day. There were lights on the midway, and you could hear the crackle of the gambling machines and the music and the merry-go-round and the voice of the man in the Beano booth calling out the numbers. And the children felt refreshed after their nap, and Fern met her friend, Henry Fussy, and he invited them to ride with him on the Ferris wheel. He even bought a ticket for her, so it didn't cost her anything. When Mrs. Arable happened to look up into the starry sky and saw her little daughter sitting up with Henry Fussy and going higher and higher into the air, saw how happy Fern looked, she just shook her head. "My, oh my," she said. "Henry Fussy. Think of that." Templeton kept out of sight in the tall grass behind the cattle barn, and he found a folded newspaper, and inside it were leftovers from somebody's lunch. A deviled ham sandwich, a piece of Swiss cheese, part of a hard-boiled egg, and the core of a wormy apple. The rat called in and ate everything he could find. Then he tore a word out of the paper, rolled it up, and started back to Wilbur's pen. Charlotte had her web almost finished when Templeton returned carrying the newspaper clipping. She had left a space in the middle of the web. At this hour, no people were around the pig pens, so the rat and the spider, the pig, were all by themselves. "I hope you brought me a good word," Charlotte said. "It is the last word I shall ever write." "Here," said Templeton, unrolling the paper. "What does it say?" asked Charlotte. "You'll have to read it for me." "It says humble," replied the rat. "Humble," said Charlotte. "Humble. Humble has two meanings. It means not proud, and it means near the ground." "Well, that's Wilbur all over. He's not proud, and he's near the ground." "Well, I hope you're satisfied," sneered the rat. "I'm not going to spend all my time fetching and carrying. I came to this fair to enjoy myself, not to deliver papers." "You've been very helpful. Thank you," said Charlotte. "Now run along if you want to see more of the fair." The rat grinned. "I'm going to make a night of it," he said. The old sheep was right. This fair is a rat's paradise. What eating, what drinking, and everywhere there's good hiding, good hunting. Bye-bye, my humble Wilbur. Fare thee well, Charlotte, you old schemer. This will be a night to remember in a rat's lifetime. He vanished into the shadows and was gone. Charlotte went back to her work. It was quite dark now. In the distance, the fireworks were going off. Rockets were scattering fiery balls of fire in the sky. And by the time the Arables and the Zuckermans and Louvie returned from the grandstand, Charlotte had finished her web. The word humble was woven neatly into the center. Nobody noticed it in the darkness. Everyone was tired, but they were happy. Fern and Avery climbed into the truck, and they lay down. They pulled the Indian blanket over them. Louvie gave Wilbur a forkful of fresh straw, and Mr. Arable patted him. "Time for us to go home," he said. "See you tomorrow, Wilbur." The grown-ups climbed slowly into the truck, and Wilbur heard the engine start and then heard the truck moving away at a low speed. He would have felt lonely and homesick had Charlotte not been there with him. He never felt lonely when Charlotte was near. In the distance, he could still hear the music of the merry-go-round, and as he was dropping off to sleep, he spoke to Charlotte. "Sing me that song again about the dung in the dark," he begged. "Not tonight," she said in a low voice. "I'm too tired." Her voice didn't seem to come from her web. "Where are you?" asked Wilbur. "I can't see you. Are you on your web?" "I'm back here," she answered, "up in this back corner." "Why aren't you on your web?" asked Wilbur. "You almost never leave your web." "Well, I left it for tonight," she said. Wilbur closed his eyes. "Charlotte," he said after a while, "do you really think Zuckerman will let me live and not kill me when the cold weather comes? Do you really think so?" "Of course," said Charlotte. "You are a famous pig, and you are a good pig, and tomorrow you will probably win a prize. The whole world will hear about you, and Zuckerman will be proud and happy to own such a pig, and you have nothing to fear, Wilbur, nothing at all, nothing to worry about. Maybe you'll live forever, who knows? Now, please go to sleep." For a while there was no sound. Then Wilbur's voice broke the silence. "What are you doing up there, Charlotte? What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm making something," she said. "Making something, as usual." "Is it something for me?" asked Wilbur. "No," said Charlotte. "It's something for me, for a change." "Please tell me what it is," begged Wilbur. "I'll tell you in the morning," said Charlotte. "When the first light comes into the sky and the sparrows stir and the cows rattle their chains and the rooster crows and the stars fade and early cars whisper along the highway, you look up here and I'll show you something. I will show you my masterpiece." Before she finished the sentence, Wilbur was asleep. She could tell by the sound of his breathing that he was sleeping peacefully, deep in the straw. Miles away at the Arable's house, The men sat around the kitchen table, eating a dish of canned peaches and talking over the events of the day. Upstairs, Avery was already in bed and asleep, and Mrs. Arbell was tucking Fern into her bed. "Did you have a good time at the fair?" she asked. She kissed her daughter. Fern nodded. "I had the best of times. I've had the best time I've ever had anywhere in all my life, in all my whole life." "Well," said Mrs. Arbell, "isn't that nice?" And that's the end of chapters 16 and 17, or 17 and 18. And so I hope that we got everything read up to where it needs to be. I love you, kids. Good night.